Hi, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to the CDP webinar, Hurricanes Irma and Maria, State of Recovery. This is Bob Ottenhoff. I'm the president and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. To provide some insight on the state of recovery following Hurricanes Irma and Maria 1 year ago, and to discuss effective disaster recovery giving, we have four esteemed colleagues on the line today to offer their perspective and wisdom. Brennan Banks is the head of operations for Hurricane Irma for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Up until recently, Brennan was based in the Caribbean and working in support of Antigua, Barbuda, St. Kitts, and Nevis. Dee Brown is the president of the Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands. Both Brennan and Dee served on our advisory committee for the 2017 Atlantic Hurricanes Recovery Fund, and we want to thank them for their special contributions to CDP's work. Denise Gilliam is the philanthropic advisor in FEMA's Office of Response and Recovery. Currently, Denise is based in the Virgin Islands. Regine Webster is the vice president of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, and she oversees both the CDP Hurricane Irma Recovery Fund as well as the CDP 2017 Atlantic Hurricane Season Recovery Fund. Welcome and thanks to our panel for taking time to speak with us today. We're going to divide up our time this hour into three parts to help us keep focused. First, we'll hear from Denise Gilliam to learn both about FEMA's response and recovery, focused efforts across the region affected by Hurricanes Irma and Maria. We'll also get Denise's read on how recovery is progressing across Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Second, we'll return our attention to Brennan, Dee, and Regine to hear their perspectives on the state of the recovery across the Irma and Maria affected regions. And then third, we'll spend the final part of our time together fielding your questions so that you can send through the Q&A function on the Zoom webinar. So please use the Q&A function. It makes it easier for our team to navigate your questions. You can find that at the bottom of your screen. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be added to our website here at CDP. And if you're on Twitter, please use the hashtag CDP4Recovery to share the discussion. So we want to also say thanks to the UPS Foundation. This webinar would not have been possible with their support, and we're grateful for their commitment to the Center for Disaster Recovery programs and to our effective disaster grant making. So let's start now by turning over to Denise Gilliam from FEMA for a comprehensive overview situation on the ground, including Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Denise, welcome to our webinar.
Thank you, Bob, for the kind introduction, and I want to apologize in advance for background noise. We don't have a secure room, so I apologize. We'll try to mute when we're not speaking here. I'm located here in St. Croix right now, and I want to say that the 2017-2018 has been the busiest year in my 12 years with FEMA. We have been taking our FEMA staff, have been leaving one disaster after 50 weeks on one site and heading directly to the next disaster. That's happening right now as I speak. So it's really been an extraordinarily busy year. And when I started in September of 2017 at our National Response Coordination Center, we really had a record activation for that center, and really it continues now with the activation for Florence. So it's really been an extraordinarily busy year. So I was able to work at the coordination center last year, and then I moved on to North Carolina first, then Florida, then the U.S. Virgin Islands, brief time in Puerto Rico, and basically who knows what will follow after this. So it's really been quite a remarkable year. And now, 1 year later, with some of the information we've received from everywhere affected by Irma and Maria, things are just starting to evolve in the recovery effort. Homes are just starting to get repaired and rebuilt. Families are just returning. So I think that's really the emerging story, that it's the beginning stage of recovery. It almost feels like 1 year later is actually what it starts to feel like in recovery here. And that certainly is what it feels like here in the Virgin Islands for me, having been here for the last several months. So one of the things we wanted to get across to our partners is that we know that the success for recovery really requires that serious teamwork that we've seen with all our philanthropic partners. And I've been extremely fortunate to work with Dee and Celia and Deanna here in the community foundations based in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And I feel very fortunate for those partnerships. And we really see that that teamwork has made all the difference in how the recovery efforts move forward in a positive way. So we're going to continue to find better ways to do our work, ways to make things go faster, get survivors back in their homes more quickly. And we're really trying a lot of new initiatives, which are really showing promise for great paths forward to be new models for disaster recovery. And later on in the presentation, I'll talk about the individual impacts and the things that are going on in each of the different islands and communities we're going to talk about. And one story to consider, actually, for everyone listening, I think is important. I have a Florida story, and we should, consider a family who was in need of support after evacuating from Puerto Rico. They arrived in Broward County, Florida, post-Maria, and they had a child that needed multiple surgeries that were just not going to be possible in Puerto Rico at that time. They were referred to a case manager who was able to secure assistance from 6 different agencies that provided all the help for the family. The child received medical care. The father received a new job to help provide for his family. They also received housing and clothing and furnishings, and all of their basic needs were provided. And this assistance actually provided a path forward for this family to avoid being separated, and really allowed them to move forward in their recovery and independence for their new life in Florida. So I think that's a really good example of how everybody's working together in this teamwork I was talking about, to not only help families in the communities that were impacted, but also to help the evacuee families that really have mostly been in Florida, but in many states across the continental U.S. So we really appreciate all the efforts that the community foundations and other agencies have made to make those success stories really happen for families. So now we could actually look at housing in our slide on Florida. We have examples of 2 new housing initiatives that happened in the Florida Keys and Monroe County. One was the Habitat home, and another was a Florida Keys Land Trust home, which is a new initiative that actually buys property and allows homeowners to have an affordable home ownership program. And we think that's going to be very successful in the Florida Keys. They had over 3,000 homes that were significantly damaged or destroyed. And really many of those residents were just unable to start a viable recovery there. So we're really excited and happy with some of the new initiatives that Monroe County has given. But again, the timing is everything. This is a year later. These homes have just been completed. So 1 year after Irma, these homes are just able to be moved into. And one thing that's really worth mentioning in Monroe County, the Florida Keys, is that they have very high suicide rates prior to the disaster. In fact, their rates are the highest in Florida. And the sport fishing industry has been destroyed. There's been a greatly reduced revenue, wages, and any affordable housing. And there's a real effort to provide that workforce affordable housing in order for those businesses to come back and actually be able to be back to the state they were before post-Irma. So we're going to move on to the territory of recovery with the U.S. Virgin Islands. And that, of course, includes St. Croix, St. John, St. Thomas, and Water Island. And we were very fortunate in the USVI to have my partner, Lori Bertman from the Pennington Family Foundation, and also one of the board chairs for CDP as a special ambassador on the FEMA team. She went everywhere with us, was a trooper and sleeping all different places every night, traveling all over the place, met with Dee and our other partners here, and really helped us have a new lens on what it would look like for a philanthropist to come and actually visit the islands and work directly with our team. I think it's the first time we've ever had someone do that. So we were really happy to have Lori do that. And she had a lot of good insights and actually branded the recovery in the USVI with the hashtag calling it Rainbow Rock Love Recovery. And Rainbow is the island of St. Croix, Rock is St. Thomas, and Love is St. John. So we're really thankful to Lori and CDP for allowing her volunteer work here with us. And that really what it was all about. We had lots of incidences where durable medical equipment was lost, so we had all our teams working together to get all that medical equipment and resources for those people with disabilities who lost their equipment during the hurricanes. And one of the more interesting stories for the island of St. Croix in particular was that the patients that needed dialysis treatment were no longer able to receive the services on the island because the hospital equipment was no longer functional. So FEMA actually evacuated those folks to Atlanta, and I'm really happy to tell you that those patients are on their way back to St. Croix, and the dialysis equipment is being installed as we speak. So they plan to have the first treatments available to those returning disaster survivor families as early as October 8th. So that really is a great sign of recovery here on the island of St. Croix, and just, really excited and happy to hear that happening. So next slide on the Virgin Islands is kind of the numbers game. FEMA's really famous for throwing out our numbers of what kind of resources we've put on the street. And I think it's pretty impressive. We have, as the figure shows, $625 million who've actually been given out in our individual and household grant program to survivors. The public assistance numbers of 1.3 billion, we know those numbers will rise. Certainly, there are a lot of things that haven't happened yet that will be funded. So we're just happy to see, sort of that picture of survival and recovery 1 year later after Maria is interesting for us. So the next slide is some numbers on Puerto Rico. I think it's not exactly the same, but we basically are just showing some general figures and numbers, and we certainly are able to get more information if anyone has specific questions on some of those other programs. But this is just kind of a snapshot 1 year later of what the funding resources have been coming out for Puerto Rico at this time. So those numbers will go up as well as the years go by, and we're talking years. The public assistance program, we will have staff, we will have lots of funding going out for those public infrastructure programs for many, many years to come. So that's an evolving process. And then we just wanted to talk briefly about some new initiatives that are happening in Puerto Rico. And one is the Hub of Philanthropic Engagement. It's a brand new initiative that was started by FEMA there, and it's specific to Puerto Rico. And basically, they really intend to provide support to the donor community on the island, both national and international support, and really provide the service providers some assistance to address current and long-term recovery needs. So the Hub is not a grants program, but they really hope to be a bridge to some additional resources on on the sustainability road that Puerto Rico is trying to follow. And they're really hoping to tailor their collaborative efforts with those nonprofits, with the local municipalities, and all the service-oriented organizations to help identify resources and technical support. So they really want to help do the best match for unmet needs that they possibly can. And then a really exciting new development, and it's actually a pilot project for FEMA, but it's called VALOR, and it stands for Voluntary Agencies Leading and Organizing Repairs. So basically, FEMA is partnering with voluntary organizations to provide minor repairs to the disaster survivors' homes and make them clean and secure and ready for potential other further rebuilding efforts. So FEMA will supply the supplies and materials and the personal protective equipment to all of those agencies that are participating in this program. So far, to this day, about $840,000 worth of building materials have been used by these organizations doing temporary repairs. There are over 100 organizations that are working in this program, and they've to date done over 1,400 homes with these repairs. And that program will continue until many of those homeowners are able to be back in their homes, and we will continue providing assistance, which really allows those organizations to free up donated dollars for other things. So we really think it's a great way of showing our support for those volunteers that are coming in to do the rebuilds in Puerto Rico. And there's a lot of interest in that program moving forward. I think you're going to see that something in the future that we will probably be activating on other disasters. But right now, it's a pilot program dedicated only to Puerto Rico at this time. So I really want to share a message that we received from the executive director of the Monroe County Long-Term Recovery Group that we worked extensively with. And this message came to us after the threats for Florence were happening. And this is a message from her. She said, as the Florida Keys have watched Hurricane Florence develop and head towards our neighbors in the Carolinas and the rest of the East Coast, we share a sadness and anxiety to know what could be ahead for so many there. We appreciate that recovery lasts long after the cameras and the news crews leave, that the water receding and wind stopping are only the end of the storm, not the end of recovery. The Monroe County Long-Term Recovery Group continues to be grateful for those who recognize and support our ongoing recovery, which we hope not only restores our community, but prepares us to be more resilient for the future. And pending any questions, that's my report under 10 minutes, I hope.
Denise, thank you so much. We've been listening to Denise Gilliam. She's the philanthropic advisor in FEMA's Office of Response and Recovery. I was struck, Denise, by something you said near the beginning where you said, we're just beginning the recovery. And to our listeners, that might sound surprising that it's a year later and you're talking about the beginning of the recovery. Could you amplify a little bit your remarks on that? And how long do you think FEMA will be in places like Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands?
That's a great question, Bob. And I think, you know, for those of us who know some of these displaced families and have lived through these events before, I think that people being back in their homes is one of the first hopeful signs of recovery. And that's why I wanted to show the Habitat and the Land Trust homes, because it is really almost a year where those rebuilding efforts have happened. So we really are looking many, many years down the road. The FEMA programs will continue for many, many years. I can't give you an estimate, but I know, for example, in Louisiana, after Katrina, we still have a presence there. We're still working our public assistance program. After the Loma Prieta earthquake in California, they were there over 15 years or so. So I really say that there's going to be a FEMA presence in many of these areas for many, many years to come. And we are actually hiring people full-time to work in these offices and setting up what we call long-term recovery offices.
So second question is about housing. So wherever we go, CDP's team, we hear about the lack of affordable housing. Texas, Louisiana, Miami, and you talked a lot about housing in your presentation. Not all of our listeners may fully understand what FEMA can do with housing and not do. And if you could explain that a little bit. You showed us a couple of pictures of new housing, and I'm curious to know if that's a role that FEMA is also playing on both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands.
Sure. Well, we actually have programs that we give funding to the state to do repairs on housing. And so we've done that in Texas, we've done that in Louisiana, we're doing it in Florida. So we can actually provide funding to the states and territories to do repairs with some restrictions. They have to follow all the policies and procedures, and there are certainly eligibility requirements, which I won't go into because it's different for every household. And I think that's what's important. Every survivor family is different. Every option that FEMA possibly has to offer those families to get them back into their homes and make them safe and sanitary and secure. That's really our goal. So sometimes it's a supplement to the FEMA grant, or it's a supplement to the insurance, which a lot of families are underinsured even if they have insurance. So we do have some ability to actually grant funds to the states. And then the other thing that happens, which is really going to be very significant, both in Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands, is the Disaster Community Development Block Grants, which will really allow those unmet needs based on housing and some other things to be met by very large amounts of money. The award is over $1.8 billion for the U.S. Virgin Islands, for example, and much, much more than that for Puerto Rico. So that's sort of the ultimate security at the end of this, that when those funds come in, they will be able to meet a lot of those unmet housing needs.
Okay, so we've heard a lot of discussion about FEMA's role in Puerto Rico in particular after Hurricane Maria, and wanted to just give you an opportunity to give your perspective, or maybe the official perspective of FEMA, on how you would characterize the governmental and as well the non-governmental responses to Maria.
Well, I only spent a week over there myself personally, but many of my colleagues from FEMA headquarters have been there for up to 50 weeks now as well. And what I really like to say is I see a real leaning forward in Puerto Rico to find solutions to big problems. And they are taking a sector approach and looking at every sector individually and bringing all the available resources and partners together to try to find solutions. And what, when you're in a commonwealth that has an aging infrastructure, that became very difficult. And I think one of the things that our administrator Brock Long said that really resonated with me with regard to the power plants being restored, when he mentioned that, well, actually FEMA doesn't hire electricians. FEMA doesn't have electricians on staff. We give funding to the localities and the municipalities, and they are able to use that grant funding to get necessary repairs made. So I think the big message for Puerto Rico is that everyone's going to have to come together and share their resources and leverage their resources. And I think one of the things I didn't really have a chance to mention is really the exciting opportunities that lie ahead for foundations to actually apply for mitigation grant funding. We have two of the community foundations, at least here in the U.S. Virgin Islands, who have actually applied to our hazard mitigation grant program for infrastructure projects. And it looks very likely that they will be doing that. So they'll have access to millions of dollars of FEMA mitigation grant money as a result of the opportunities that are here in this disaster and the funding that's available. So I think we also have an exciting news, the Economic Development Administration is funding a community foundation in Puerto Rico. I think it's $5.58 million for their project. So in other words, FEMA is not asking funders for money. We're actually sharing opportunities for the funders to increase their ability to receive federal funds, and we're really excited about that opportunity.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Denise. And that's a great segue to our next guest. We'd like to bring into our conversation Dee Brown. She's the president of the Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands, and she's in the Virgin Islands today. Dee, welcome to the program. And why don't you start by just telling us a little bit about what's it like running a community foundation on the Virgin Islands, and what have you been focused on over the last year?
Thank you, Bob, and thank you so much for hosting this webinar today. It's, it's such a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to share the progress that we've made, and also to do outreach to our colleagues to talk a little bit about what we're hoping to do building forward. A year ago, the Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands was heading into September. We had assets of about 11 million. We were making grants of about $2 to $3 million every year. And we had built slowly over the past 27 years. We definitely had a wake-up call when Irma arrived on St. Thomas on September 6th. So in the year since that happened, CFEI has been fortunate to receive over $15 million in grants and funds and gifts from individuals, from businesses, from foundations. Some of the gifts were as small as $5, and others were in excess of $1 million. So it's been a rallying call for us at the foundation to step up to be able to use this generosity in the way that's will have the greatest impact in our recovery. We, to date, have made more than $15 million in grants, and that has been, in numbers, it's 5 times more than we've made in any past year of grant making. But we've also tried to be as creative and as strategic as we could be in making those grants. And the reason why I feel we've been able to do that is because of the network of not-for-profits in the territory. CFEI was always involved with the not-for-profit community, because from a grant-making perspective, your success is only as good as your grantees. So we have a deep respect and good connections to our not-for-profit community. So we were able to make grants 2 weeks after Hurricane Irma hit. We were able to get funding to our partners who we knew were out there doing work even before we had emails back or phones back or banks in some cases back. So we were able to really just do what we do, which is network and teamwork with our not-for-profits to address the critical needs in the community at that point.
Are you also focused on long-term recovery, and will you have the resources to engage in long-term recovery efforts?
We're definitely focused on the long term, because for us, this past year of urgent recovery was really a little outside of our lane. What we're now looking forward is what we call building forward. We want to be able to use this disaster to help us come out of the disaster better than we were going in. So the foundation is looking very much at the needs of low-income families and children. We are building on our long-time commitment to improving the early care and education of our youngest children in the territory. We're also embracing a new opportunity, grant-making opportunity, which is the marine industry. That's always been sort of a natural, wouldn't that be something that would engage the people of the Virgin Islands in a big way? And it was a small segment, in fact. So what we're really seeing is organizations coming together after the storms and talking to each other about how to engage our families, our children, from early childhood, swimming at the beach, to attending our university and getting advanced degrees in marine education. So that's another opportunity. And honestly, with our hopes about having the funding to do this work, so many organizations and individuals have told us that they will be there for us as we build forward. And some of them we've asked, give us time. We know you're there, and if you wait a bit, we'll be able to use your gift more strategically than at the moment. So I am very hopeful that we are going to have the technical assistance that we need, the manpower and woman power that we need, and also the resources that we need to come out of these storms with a more wonderful Virgin Islands.
And I imagine tourism is by far your biggest industry. Is it back to normal, would you say? Or is it, if not back to normal, how close are you to being back to normal?
That's we're definitely not back to normal. What we do, we have been very actively doing outreach to tourists to invite them back to the community. We have an increasing number of tourists coming to visit. We have challenges, particularly on the islands of St. Thomas and St. John, because so many of our major hotels were really damaged. And so but we have a vibrant, smaller inns and bed and breakfasts that are stepping up to say, if you can't stay at this large hotel, well, you can stay here. So I think what is happening is tourism is rebuilding, and it's rebuilding in a slightly different way. So again, speaking to the expanded focus on the marine industry, the Virgin Islands just has such a rich, wonderful natural habitat. And in the past, we may not have talked about that as much as we are now. And I think that tourists are really enjoying that aspect of our islands. So, it's happening. It's not happening as fast as any of us want it to happen. It's changing as it goes forward. But, I think it's going to wind up in a better place than we were before the storms.
Well, that's good to hear. Dee Brown, thank you so much for your comments. We want to turn next to Brennan Banks. Brennan, until recently, you were based in the Caribbean and working in support of Antigua, Barbuda, St. Kitts, and Nevis. And the thing that strikes me is these are hard places to get to, even in the best of times. So what was it like trying to bring in relief and other kinds of supplies to these little islands scattered throughout the Caribbean?
Yeah, thank you, Bob, for your question. And thank you once again also for organizing this webinar and bringing our colleagues together to reflect on the experience for the last year. As you mentioned, I've been working for about 10 of the last 12 months in Antigua and Barbuda, as well as supporting Hurricane Irma response recovery efforts in St. Kitts and Nevis. But the far majority of my work has been on the island of Barbuda, which many of the participants probably have heard about, was affected by Hurricane Irma and took a direct hit. As you mentioned in your question, Bob, it was very difficult in terms of overcoming some of the logistical challenges. Obviously, with humanitarian response and disaster response recovery programs, quite often we face many logistical and other unique challenges. This one was exceptional because we were dealing with a island nation that consisted of multiple islands. So we were dealing with an affected population on a sister island while being based primarily and working primarily with partners on the non-affected sister island, this being the case of Antigua and Barbuda. So it presented a lot of challenges in terms of how do we ensure that we can efficiently move our material resources, human resources to the affected population and ensure that these forms of assistance were as close as possible to the affected community on Barbuda. And what we did actually, and I think this has been a big case study for us in the Caribbean, and something that other island nations will learn from, is we used cash transfer programming as a main mechanism for providing humanitarian assistance, both for the response and some of the early recovery activities. And what that enabled or allowed us to do was to overcome some of the traditional logistical challenges we would face when it comes to moving people and items to the affected areas. So we felt that the cash transfer program and empowering people with financial assistance to go out and to start the recovery process was a more effective form of assistance, because it, again, removed a lot of the logistical burdens, the additional costs that were associated with moving people and stuff to a small sister island. And more importantly, it empowered individuals, empowered families to determine exactly what forms of assistance they needed. In addition to that, again, we're talking about a small community in Barbuda, where the entire island, the entire population, all of the markets, the businesses, and so forth were all affected. It also needed an injection of money into the community to stimulate the local economy. So again, for us, the cash transfer programming and providing direct financial assistance to those starting with the recovery process enabled us to address or overcome some of those logistical challenges that one would face when working in the Caribbean or a similar type of environment post-disaster.
So let me make sure I understand. By cash transfer, you mean you were giving cash payments to individuals to help them do the recovery work, rather than providing grants to intermediary, either government agencies or nonprofit organizations.
That's correct. And when we say cash transfer program, sometimes we focus on the word cash, but there's different forms of delivering that assistance. It could be in the form of a debit card, could be in the form of a check, could be in the form of a voucher. Quite often it's not actually cash, physical cash itself. But yes, we provided the majority of our assistance directly to those affected by Hurricane Irma. And the reason why, again, there was a relatively small population on a small island, and there weren't many community partners or other traditional philanthropies or community groups to work with. So we felt that the best approach to ensure that people could quickly begin this recovery process was to provide this assistance directly to them. And again, because it was a small population, it allowed us to take this approach. In other larger scale disasters where tens of thousands or more have been affected, these are approaches that we might not be able to implement. But in the case of Barbuda, it worked very well for us. And I just wanted to also echo what Denise said earlier, and some of the other people on the webinar might be surprised to hear, but I can also report in the case of Barbuda that the recovery process is just now really starting to pick up. And the primary reason for that was that you can't have a full recovery process begin until you have a certain percentage of the population present. You need to have a community and individuals to work with to start that recovery process. In the case of Barbuda, being such a small community, a small island, and the entire population was evacuated after Irma to Antigua, many of those people went to the sister island and started to plant roots and started new lives, and their children went to new schools, and adults took on new jobs. So we've seen a very, very slow return of the displaced population to the community, to Barbuda, and that's been the biggest barrier for having that recovery process really pick up full steam and move forward. So again, as Denise stated earlier, it's been a very slow process to get the recovery process itself started in Barbuda and many other Caribbean island nations.
All right, thank you. That's Brendan Banks. We want to turn now to Regine Webster. She's the Vice President of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, and she oversees both the CDP Hurricane Irma Recovery Fund as well as the CDP 2017 Atlantic Hurricane Season Recovery Fund. Hi, Regine.
Hey, Bob.
Hi, tell us a little bit about these two funds and what the strategy was as you deployed the funds.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to. The Center for Disaster Philanthropy, our mission statement is to transform the field of disaster philanthropy and to increase donor effectiveness throughout the life cycle of disasters. And we do that organizationally through a number of different mechanisms, but I'll speak really specifically to the two funds that you just called out. We mounted both of these funds in the wake of what you all know to be really tumultuous, storm-intensive, hundreds of thousands of people affected times. And what we knew, though, was that in addition to having homes and lives and livelihoods and roads and trees and flood damage and water damage across multiple geographies on that day, on that week, on that month, we knew that those needs wouldn't go away in that day, week, or month. And we knew very much that needs would persist throughout months and years. And so we created both of these funds as a way for the private philanthropic community to allocate their funds in that immediate, very gray sky time as a manner to prepare for when funds disappeared or were no longer available. And so we have, over the course of the past 3 or 4 months, allocated the vast majority of the funds available dollars available through both those funds. And so since the storms hit, both Maria and Irma hit last year, our staff have been undertaking site visits, meeting with long-term recovery committees, long-term recovery organizations, long-term recovery groups, depending upon how they term them, meeting and speaking with the local, state-based, and national NGOs that were doing or are doing the heavy lifting of responded. We've benefited tremendously from our colleagues over at FEMA in terms of thinking about where needs are and where needs are, quite frankly, being covered. And we've also benefited tremendously from 2 different grant committees that have helped us to guide the dollar flow out of each of those funds. Can I keep going, Bob, and tell how we ended up allocating those funds, or do you want to pause?
Yes, I was going to just ask you, though, given all the needs that we've heard about and given the demands of recovery, what did the funds end up focusing as its key issues for fund needs?
Okay. Yeah, so I'll speak first about our CDP Hurricane Irma Recovery Fund and say that when we went into our needs assessment work, we had a preconceived notion that the needs of older adults and the needs of immigrants or new Americans would really rise to the top. And we, through our research and our discussions and our outreach, really felt that in addition to those 2 issue areas being of critical importance, it was really the area of housing that rose to the top. Just thinking about the question that you asked, Bob, of Denise around affordable housing, we came up against that question time and time again about how to get people back into their homes, how to stabilize their homes and make their homes more resilient, how to think in a holistic community-based manner, and not just neighborhood community, but rather city or county manner about housing plans and housing design. And so the grant committee of the Hurricane Irma Recovery Fund really steered the CDP staff to focus very specifically on that housing need. We did it north to south, from top to bottom of the state, east to west. We did it in ways, we awarded grants in ways that prioritized the needs of older adults, prioritized new Americans, prioritized vulnerable populations, disabled populations, people of color. We did our best through that lens of housing to address the myriad of other vulnerabilities that really spoke up after Hurricane Irma. For Hurricane Maria, when we worked with our grant committee, again, as Bob said, both Brendan and Dee are on our grant committee, and they've just been awesome committee members, everything you could hope for out of a committee member, quite frankly. When we thought about allocating the over $3 million that we had in funding to both USVI, BVI, Puerto Rico, so the entirety of the Maria affected area, really, we wanted to make sure that we could get as local as possible. So we did that in 2 manners. One, we determined to to really focus all of our funding on the issues of food security, because we learned that such a large percentage of food across the Maria affected area is imported, and we felt that food security was an important step toward resilience and recovery. We also focused on livelihoods and economic development. And then lastly, we focused on the health and mental health needs of older adults. So that's the first way that the committee guided us to grant our funds. And then the second way was to do that funding allocation through an RFP process. And what we were hopeful of is that an RFP, and I believe we were successful at, is that an RFP process would uncover the local organizations doing that heavy lifting of recovery. So while we did end up funding some of the large international NGOs as well as state-based NGOs, you'll see on the list of our grantee recipients that local voice is just really shines right through. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Regine. We want to remind our listeners that if you have a question for our panelists, now is the time to do it. You can go to the box at the bottom of your screen and type in your question, and we'll be happy to answer it. While we're waiting for some more questions to come in, I want to ask all four of the panelists if they would answer this question and try to do it in 30 seconds or so. But I'm curious to know if there's some new practice or some new approach that was tried by an NGO or a funder this year, over the last year, that really caught your attention as something we can learn from for the future. Denise, do you want to go first? So I'm looking for a new approach or a new idea. While we're waiting for Denise, does anybody else want to jump in?
This is Dee. One of the things that I would say we wound up doing, which we would now be stronger to continue, was creating fiscal sponsorship so that organizations that weren't normally doing charitable work could establish relationships with CFBI, and then were able to put their expertise, their business powers toward helping the islands recover in a very charitable way. And it was it needed to be an immediate response to that request, and it was very successful in helping people in the early days of getting generators here and food here and water here and houses starting to get rebuilt. So that was a really wonderful model that we were able to use and expand.
Brennan, how about you? Anything come to mind?
Yeah, I don't want to echo my comments earlier about the cash transfer programming, but I think that was a big success for us given the challenges we faced in Barbuda, and it was really interesting to see how that particular mechanism, a form of assistance, was used across multiple sectors, whether it be from shelter recovery to targeted livelihoods assistance, to emergency response assistance, as well as other forms of recovery at the household level. So for me, that was a big success for us to, again, identify the most appropriate mechanism to assist these communities and to ensure that we can use that across multiple sectors for maximum impact.
Okay, thanks. Regine, anything come to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we're going to call this new or innovative, Bob, but I sure will say that as a grant maker, I am appreciative of really flexible grant making, and I certainly know that that many funders have really transitioned their disaster grant making to just that, of working with trusted partners and trusting their expertise. I'll also say I think that out of the negative of having more and more disasters, the positive is that private philanthropy has such a better understanding of FEMA, and that understanding is growing. And I think that only makes us stronger so that we're bolstering and scaffolding each other's work.
All right, so I want to go on to another question, and this is another learning question. 1 year later, given what you now know about these hurricanes and the work you've been doing, what do you wish you would have done differently a year ago? Who wants to start that one? Dee, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah. In some ways, I feel that it took a while to realize how flexible you needed to be. And you had to kind of like look back and see, okay, what kind of resources and expertise do I have in my board, in my staff, in my community that I can really harness for this going forward? And I think the disasters forced us to look outside of some of our normal grant making to realize that there are ways to empower our partners to do the important work. So that was a good learning lesson, and I think we'll never go back.
That's a good life lesson, I guess, for all of us. Yeah, thank you. Denise, how about you? Are you there now? Okay, I guess we've lost Denise. Brennan, how about you? Some thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I have two comments, and I think they're more operational, so it might be boring for some. But as someone overseeing the operations, obviously I reflect now on my staffing structure, and as Dean indicated, really looking at maybe I could have benefited from this particular expertise or these type of skills or this particular profile of a team member. So that's one area that I think any operations manager always will reflect on afterwards. And I think second, again, looking at the recovery process, it's been relatively slow to start. Getting closer to the community quicker to really embed yourself with the community, embed your organization fully with the community so that they can be reassured that there are humanitarian partners and others that are committed to supporting them through the emergency phase and to assist them with starting the recovery phase and supporting them through that recovery phase. So again, ensuring that the organization and other humanitarian partners are embedded and working more closely with the communities. And I think we all were a little bit slow with arriving on Barbuda and really embedding ourselves because the majority of the population had been displaced to the sister island. But again, in hindsight, I think we could have maybe taken the lead and show the other humanitarian partners, what the best approach would be to support the community affected by Hurricane Irma in the case of Barbuda.
Thanks, Brendan. Regine, any thoughts on this one?
I mean, Bob, if I were an author able to rewrite the story of last year's hurricane season, I would put a considerably more time, months or years, in between Harvey, Irma, and Maria. But since I am not an author, I actually think I'll 100% echo Brennan's comments about staff capacity and getting local faster.
Okay, next question. And by the way, I want to remind everybody again, if you've got a question for these panelists, be sure to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and let us know what your question is. I guess this next one is sort of looking ahead. We're now in the 2018 Atlantic hurricane season. We just have been going through the experience of Hurricane Florence, and there seems like there's more hurricanes on the way. What are your concerns right now about these places like Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands? And Dee, let's start with you. Is this something you're thinking about as we enter the sort of the peak of the 2018 hurricane season?
Yeah, I would be hard to deny that we're not all thinking about it and trying to be not distracted by it, but also recognizing that unprecedented last year, because Irma was unprecedented. Then 2 weeks later, we had Maria, who was unprecedented. I think it's like remembering that we need to be prepared as much as we can and not get distracted from the recovery because of being concerned about what else might be coming. At the same time, I mean, we are just so mindful of the, when Florence was heading for our neighbors in North Carolina and other places, of wanting to be sure that we used what we had learned to help them have a more successful recovery. So it's a lot of calling on us to be resilient, to be patient, to be mindful, to be caring. They're good lessons. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Brennan, what are people thinking on those little islands in the middle of the Caribbean?
Well, to be honest, I mean, I think people are still nervous. I think people are still, working through what they experienced a year ago. I know, speaking for my organization, we did a lot of psychosocial support for the community and for the youth. So there's still a lot of, anxiety, nervousness. Again, we had Beryl threatened a few weeks ago. We had Isaac last week threatened, and people are still uneasy about the potential of another devastating hurricane coming through the community. But I think also we need to have stronger conversations about how can we better prepare these communities and these governments for what will be more stronger hurricanes coming through every year. And that's one thing we try to focus on, is really working with the government, working with the community to see how we could strengthen some of the disaster risk management structures and capacities, and ensure that we've learned from the Irma and Maria experience and make some investments in ensuring that these communities and these governments are better prepared and in a better position to respond to any future hurricanes that may hit their islands.
Regine, any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I mean, only just as Brennan says, we're all watching, right? We're all glued to the NOAA maps and thinking and considering what effective preparedness and effective recovery looks like. And I'm thankful to know that there's resources like FEMA, like the operational NGOs, like the community foundations that Dee runs, and like CDP exist.
All right, final question to all of you. We're about out of time, and so we want to use this as kind of a wrap-up question. It seems like from a funding standpoint, commitments to Hurricane Irma and Maria are about coming to an end. But then also listening to you, it sounds like the work is not to an end. What would you like to say to the donors who may be listening to this webinar, and what kind of encouragement could you be giving them in terms of their donor activity? So let's start with Dee, and then go to Brennan, and then go to Regine.
Well, I guess I would just ask donors to stick with us, because the best is yet to come. We're now doing the work of rebuilding our communities to a better place than they were before the storms, and we will need their support, their guidance, their expertise.
Brennan?
Yeah, I would echo a comment made earlier. I think Dee made the comment about flexible funding. Again, as an implementer and someone that oversees humanitarian operations, I just cannot preach how important it is to have flexible funding when you're implementing emergency systems and starting with recovery support, because the situation is constantly evolving every day, every week. Plans of actions are being rewritten every week, every month. So having flexible funding allows humanitarian actors and partners on the ground to provide the most appropriate and meaningful assistance for that particular moment, for that particular community. And I encourage the philanthropic world and foundations to continue to look for ways to be more creative, innovative with flexible funding to empower our responding partners with the tools they need to succeed and support these communities.
I'll jump in and echo every of those two sentiments, which are really to me about staying present and staying attentive. We even know after this past week that when I said this to Bob the other day on the phone, I said, I receive at least a query a month about Hurricane Matthew, and Hurricane Matthew was in 2016, and the needs persist, and so the needs of Hurricanes Irma and Maria are going to persist well after the next storm rolls in and makes itself known, like Hurricane Florence did this week.
Well, we've run out of time, and unfortunately, we're going to have to bring this webinar to an end. I want to say thanks so much to our panelists, Denise and Dee and Brennan and Regine, for taking time out of their busy schedules to share their insights. We learned a lot today. Special thanks to the UPS Foundation for their support of this webinar series. Thanks to all of you for joining in. Thanks to Ruja for all of her work in producing this webinar for us. And if you have questions that we didn't get a chance to address today, we'd love to hear from you. You can write to me or Regine, and we'll be happy to talk to you. Thanks again for your time, and have a great afternoon.